I hadn't been back to that house in over a year, not since the final argument with Dad. Still, when his new wife, my stepmom Lila, reached out with an invitation, something tugged at me to go. "It would be nice to see you," she'd written, her words kind, familiar. "I think we both need it." Lila was always thoughtful, even during the roughest parts of our blended family life. She'd come into my world when I was 17, a freshly married woman brimming with love for my dad and hope for our family. She was nothing like the fairy tale evil stepmother. Lila was calm, composed, always with a gentle smile. And she was young, only 10 years older than me. Yet, despite her kindness, I had kept my distance, focused on leaving for college and building a life separate from theirs. But today, a summer Saturday, I found myself pulling up the gravel driveway to the familiar site of our house nestled behind rows of flowering magnolias. It was one of the few things that hadn't changed. Lila, however, had transformed. The last I remembered, she wore her hair in straight, neat styles, her outfits practical, like someone who had always put others' needs first. Now, she stood by the garden gate in a flowing dress, her curls wild in the breeze, a vibrant splash of color against the green backdrop. She waved as I got out of the car, her smile bright. "Eli, I didn't think you'd make it." "Hi, Lila," I replied, giving an awkward wave back. Her eyes seemed to soften as she looked me over. "Let me show you something," she gestured toward the garden, leading the way without waiting for a response. Lila's footsteps were light as she guided me along a winding path between lush, blooming flower beds. I noticed she'd done a lot since I'd last been here. There were roses in full bloom, tall lavender bushes humming with bees, and colorful wildflowers that gave the space a whimsical charm. This wasn't the garden I'd known. It felt like Lila had poured herself into every inch of it, letting go of the woman I remembered. "This place, it's beautiful," I said almost to myself, my voice hushed in the quiet of the garden. Lila turned, her eyes holding mine for a beat too long before looking away with a shy smile. "Thank you." "I put my heart into it," she replied, almost whispering. There was a tenderness in her voice I hadn't heard before, a softness that made me feel as if she was sharing something personal, something sacred. The winding garden path continued, leading to a secluded area at the far end, surrounded by tall hedges and towering sunflowers. There, nestled between the greenery, was a small wrought iron bench and a table with a set of cups and a teapot. The place felt intimate, almost secret, as though she'd crafted it for quiet moments away from the rest of the world. "Sit with me," she asked, settling onto the bench, her gaze soft and inviting. I nodded, feeling a strange flutter of anticipation as I sat beside her. We talked at first about light things, the weather, my job, her plans for the garden. Her laughter was warm, melodic, and it filled the space around us, dissolving the usual distance between us. I found myself watching her more closely, noticing the way her eyes sparkled when she smiled, the subtle grace in the way she moved her hands as she spoke. She felt different, like someone I hadn't truly known before. At one point, Lila's gaze drifted past me, her smile fading into something wistful. "Your dad's been traveling a lot for work lately," she said quietly. "It gets lonely here sometimes." She glanced down at her hands, a small sigh escaping her lips. I wasn't sure what to say, but I felt a sudden urge to reach out, to bridge the space between us. "I know it can't be easy," I murmured, trying to sound as comforting as I could. "I'm sorry I haven't visited much." Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her dress, the air between us growing thick with something unspoken. "No need to apologize, Eli. I understand." Her voice was barely a whisper. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine, and for a moment everything around us faded: the garden, the sunlight, the distant sounds of birds. There was only the two of us, caught in a moment neither of us seemed to know how to navigate. She reached out, her hand hovering for just a second before resting lightly on mine. The touch was simple, innocent even, but it felt charged, as though it carried a weight neither of us could ignore. My pulse quickened and I felt warmth rise in my cheeks as I looked down at our hands, the familiar lines of her fingers interlaced with mine. "I've missed having you around, Eli," she admitted, her voice soft and tinged with vulnerability. Lila's hand lingered on mine, her fingers tracing small circles along my knuckles in a gentle, absent-minded way. The warmth of her touch seeped into my skin, and I felt an unspoken understanding pass between us, one that neither of us could deny. I wanted to speak, to acknowledge whatever was happening in that silent, tense moment, but the words eluded me. "Sometimes I wish things had turned out differently," she murmured, almost to herself. Her voice was barely audible, a soft confession that hung in the air between us. She looked down, and a shadow crossed her face, like she was wrestling with something deep inside. And that we had more time to know each other before everything became so complicated. Her words resonated within me, and I felt a pang of something guilt, perhaps, for how distant I'd been over the years, and maybe a hint of regret for all the time lost. Lila and I had always shared an odd bond, a familiarity that neither of us had fully explored. Yet now, sitting here in this quiet corner of her garden, I realized there was so much I didn't know about her, so much I had never thought to ask or understand. "Lila," I began, my voice hoarse. I couldn't find the right words, so instead, I let my hand turn under hers, intertwining our fingers more intentionally, giving her a silent reassurance that I was here, listening. She looked up, her eyes searching mine, filled with something raw and vulnerable, something I hadn't seen before. "You've grown up so much, Eli," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "It's like you're a stranger now, yet here you are, and it feels like home." Her lips quivered into a soft, tentative smile, her cheeks flushing the faintest shade of pink. The way she looked at me in that moment felt both comforting and unsettling, a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite unravel. And yet, I didn't pull away. I couldn't. I felt a familiar ache, a mixture of yearning and uncertainty, rising within me as her hand tightened around mine. The world around us seemed to fade, leaving just the two of us, cocooned in the warmth of our shared silence. I didn't know what was happening, what this feeling was between us, but something had shifted, and I knew there was no going back. "Eli," she breathed, her voice trailing off as her eyes dropped to my lips. Time seemed to stretch, each second waited with anticipation, neither of us daring to break the moment. My heart raced, pounding against my chest as I inched closer, feeling the magnetic pull between us growing stronger, undeniable. Lila's hand moved to my cheek, her fingers brushing my skin with a softness that made my breath hitch. Her gaze flickered back to mine, a silent question lingering in her eyes, and then, as if driven by some unseen force, she leaned in, her lips hovering just a whisper away from mine. The space between us was filled with the sound of our breaths, mingling in the charged air as we lingered on the brink of something neither of us could fully comprehend. And then finally our lips met in a hesitant, feather-light kiss, a spark igniting as our mouths connected. The kiss was tentative at first, uncertain, as though both of us were testing the waters, feeling the depth of whatever lay between us. But as the seconds passed, it deepened, our mouths moving together with a hunger neither of us could restrain. I felt her hand slip to the back of my neck, pulling me closer as I wrapped my arms around her, holding her as though she might disappear at any moment. Time ceased to matter as we lost ourselves in that kiss, the world around us fading until only she remained, soft and warm in my arms. It was a kiss filled with years of longing, of unspoken words and hidden desires finally set free. When we pulled away, breathless and flushed, I stared into her eyes, searching for any hint of regret, but there was none. Only a warmth that mirrored my own, a shared understanding that whatever had just happened between us was real. "Eli," she whispered, her voice shaky but resolute. "I don't know where this will lead or what it means, but I don't want it to end." Neither did I. I looked into Lila's eyes, seeing a mixture of longing and fear flickering there, like she was waiting for some signal from me to confirm that this wasn't just a fleeting impulse, that I felt it too, that I wouldn't run from what we'd just shared. I could feel the weight of unspoken words lingering between us, the emotions that had been kept at bay for so long finally rising to the surface. "I don't want it to end either," I murmured, barely recognizing my own voice. My hand moved to her cheek, fingers brushing softly along her skin as I traced the faint lines of worry there. The way she looked at me, her eyes wide and vulnerable, stirred something deep within me, a protective instinct, a desire to give her the warmth and comfort she seemed to need so desperately. We stayed like that, wrapped in each other's presence, as the late afternoon sun cast golden hues over the garden, cloaking us in a gentle, dreamlike glow. Slowly, she leaned into my touch, her head tilting slightly as she closed her eyes, exhaling a soft breath that seemed to carry years of pent-up emotions. I felt a rush of tenderness toward her, a fierce need to shelter her from the world, to hold her close and reassure her that she wasn't alone. My thumb brushed gently across her cheek, and I felt her hand reach up, covering mine as if to anchor herself to the moment. "Sometimes I feel like I don't know who I am anymore," she admitted in a whisper, her eyes still closed. "It's like I'm living someone else's life, going through the motions, trying to be the person everyone expects me to be. But here, right now, with you, I feel free." Her voice trembled, breaking slightly as she spoke, and I could see the vulnerability she was showing me, how deeply she needed this moment of connection, of closeness. I tightened my arms around her, pulling her close until our foreheads touched, her breath warm against my skin. "You don't have to be anyone but yourself, Lila. Not with me." The words were soft, but I meant every one of them, hoping she could feel the sincerity behind them, the promise I was making to her. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she looked up, her gaze meeting mine with a kind of intensity that made my heart ache. She cupped my face, her fingers brushing along my jaw as she leaned in, her lips meeting mine once more, this time with a quiet desperation that spoke of everything we couldn't say aloud. The kiss deepened, becoming something raw and intense, as if we were both afraid that this would be our only chance to feel this way, to share this closeness. We pulled back, breathless, her eyes searching mine, and I saw a spark of hope there, a glimmer of the woman she'd hidden away beneath layers of responsibility and sacrifice. Lila's hand trailed down my arm, her fingers intertwining with mine, grounding us in the moment. Her gaze softened and she gave a shaky smile as if we both knew we'd crossed a line, but neither of us could bring ourselves to regret it. The garden around us seemed to hold its breath, the late afternoon silence stretching as we lingered there, wrapped in a fragile embrace that felt as delicate as it was powerful. There were so many questions left unanswered, so many uncertainties hovering at the edges of our awareness, yet all I could think about was how right it felt to be here with her in this place, in this moment. "What happens now?" she asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. I swallowed, feeling the weight of her question, knowing that there was no easy answer. "I don't know," I replied honestly, "but whatever it is, I want to face it with you." Her fingers tightened around mine, and she nodded, a faint smile breaking through the uncertainty. "Me too, Eli. Whatever it takes, I'm willing to see this through." The tension that had settled between us began to melt away as we sat there, hand in hand, sharing a silent understanding that words couldn't capture. My mind spun with questions, with worries about what this would mean, but they faded when I looked at her. At the way her eyes softened, her lips curved into a tentative smile that held a glimmer of hope. The world beyond the garden seemed distant, inconsequential. All that mattered was this fragile, powerful connection between us, something we hadn't planned for but couldn't deny. After a long silence, Lila glanced away, her gaze settling on a patch of sun-dappled flowers near the bench. "You know, I used to come out here at night sometimes," she said, her voice low, thoughtful. "When things were quiet, when I couldn't sleep. It was the only place I felt myself." Her voice trembled slightly, as if confessing a secret she'd guarded for years. It felt like the only place where I didn't have to pretend. Her vulnerability struck a chord deep within me. I squeezed her hand gently, offering her silent reassurance. "You don't have to pretend with me, Lila. Not here, not here, not ever." She smiled softly, turning her gaze back to me. Her eyes shimmered with unspoken emotions, and in that moment I realized how much she'd been holding back, the weight she'd carried alone. I reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face, my fingers lingering for just a moment longer than necessary. Her breath hitched, her eyes widening as our gazes locked, and I saw in her expression a mix of longing, fear, and hope. Slowly, tentatively, she leaned in, her hand resting on my chest, and I felt my pulse quicken under her touch. It was a simple gesture, yet it conveyed so much: a trust, a willingness to let go of the walls she'd built. My hands moved instinctively to her waist, drawing her closer until there was barely any space between us, our breaths mingling as we hovered on the edge of something unspoken, something we both knew could change everything. Our lips met again, a gentle, lingering kiss that deepened with each passing second, growing more intense, more insistent. I felt her fingers slide up to my shoulders, her grip tightening as if she were afraid to let go. The warmth of her body against mine was intoxicating, a sensation that made everything else fade away, leaving only her the feel of her touch, the taste of her lips, the quiet sighs that escaped her as we melted into each other. The kiss was slow, unrushed, filled with the kind of tenderness I hadn't known I was capable of. Her hands roamed up to my neck, her fingers slipping into my hair, and I felt a shiver run down my spine, a visceral response to the way she held me, as though I was something precious, something she'd feared losing. My own hands slid up her back, feeling the gentle curve of her spine beneath my fingers, anchoring her to me, unwilling to let go. When we finally pulled away, our foreheads touched, our breaths mingling as we stood there, wrapped in an embrace that felt both intimate and raw, as though we'd stripped away every pretense, every doubt, leaving only the truth of what we felt. Her eyes searched mine, her expression open, vulnerable, and I could see that she was grappling with the same emotions, the same questions that had been swirling in my mind. "Eli," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly, "I don't know where this will lead, but I don't want to be alone in it." Her hand reached up, brushing my cheek, her touch feather-light, and I saw the faintest hint of tears shimmering in her eyes, a reflection of the intensity of what we were both feeling. "I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." I took a shaky breath, my hand covering hers, pressing it gently to my cheek. "You won't lose me, Lila. Whatever happens, I'm here, I'm with you." Her fingers tightened around mine, her gaze filled with a mixture of relief and yearning, and in that moment I knew that I would do whatever it took to protect this connection, to hold on to the fragile, beautiful bond we'd found. The world beyond the garden faded into insignificance, and all that mattered was her, the feel of her hand in mine, the warmth of her breath, the quiet certainty that we'd found something rare, something worth fighting for. Lila leaned into me, her head resting against my shoulder, and I held her close, feeling the steady beat of her heart against mine, a silent rhythm that echoed the promise we'd made. We stayed like that, wrapped in each other's arms as the sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the garden, a quiet sanctuary that held our secrets, our hopes, and the beginning of something that felt achingly real. We sat there in the fading light, our fingers still intertwined, sharing a silence that felt more intimate than words could capture. The warmth of Lila's body against mine was a quiet comfort, a reminder of how far we'd come, of the invisible lines we'd crossed. Her head rested on my shoulder, her breath soft against my neck, and I could feel the steady rise and fall of her chest, a rhythm that seemed to match the beat of my own heart. After a while, Lila stirred, sitting up slightly to look at me, her eyes reflecting the last hues of the setting sun. There was a softness in her gaze, a vulnerability that made my chest ache. She reached up, her fingers tracing a light path along my jawline, and I leaned into her touch, savoring the warmth of her hand against my skin. It was a simple gesture, but it held a depth that words couldn't convey, a silent affirmation that whatever this was between us, it was real, something we both needed. "Eli," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if afraid to break the spell. "I've spent so many years feeling like something was missing, like I was just existing, but with you, here, I feel alive again." Her confession hung in the air between us, raw and open, and I felt a surge of emotion rise within me, a mixture of protectiveness and desire, a fierce need to shield her from the world, to hold her close and never let go. I reached out, cupping her face, my thumb brushing softly over her cheek. "You don't have to feel that way anymore, Lila. You have me. I'm here." Her eyes searched mine, and in that moment I saw a spark of hope, a glimmer of the woman she'd kept hidden away, buried beneath years of loneliness and sacrifice. She leaned into my touch, her eyes closing as she took a shaky breath, as if grounding herself in the reality of my presence. When she looked at me again, there was a quiet determination in her gaze, a strength that took my breath away. Slowly she reached out, her fingers trailing down my arm, and I felt my pulse quicken at the intimacy of her touch. The air between us grew heavy with anticipation, a tension that hummed just beneath the surface, as though we were standing on the edge of something vast and uncharted. I moved closer, our faces inches apart, our breaths mingling in the quiet space between us, and I felt her hand come to rest on my chest, her touch warm and grounding. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and fear. I didn't hesitate, my hand covering hers, pressing it gently against my heart. I've never been more sure of anything. A smile broke across her face, tentative but full of relief, and I leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was both tender and urgent, a promise and a confession all at once. She responded with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around my neck as she pressed herself closer, our bodies melding together in a way that felt inevitable, as if we'd been waiting our whole lives for this moment. The kiss deepened, becoming something raw and intense, and I felt her fingers slide into my hair, tugging gently as if to anchor herself to me. Her touch was soft but insistent, each caress a silent plea, a reminder of everything we'd held back, of the longing we'd hidden away. My hand slid to her waist, pulling her closer, and I could feel the warmth of her body pressed against mine, a sensation that sent a shiver down my spine, heightening every sense, every nerve. We pulled apart, breathless, our foreheads resting together as we lingered in the aftermath of the kiss, our eyes locked in a gaze that spoke of unspoken promises and shared desires. Lila's hand slipped down to my shoulder, her fingers tracing gentle circles that sent a warmth through me, grounding me in the reality of her presence, of the connection we'd found. "This feels like a dream," she murmured, her voice soft, filled with wonder, like something I never thought I could have. "It's real," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "We're real." She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek, and I reached up, brushing it away with a tenderness that surprised even me. Her hand covered mine, her fingers lacing through mine as she held my gaze, and in that moment, I knew that this was only the beginning, that we had crossed into something profound, something that would change us both forever. The garden around us was bathed in twilight, the last rays of sunlight casting a soft glow over us as we held each other, a quiet sanctuary that felt like it belonged to us alone. For the first time, we weren't just Eli and Lila, stepmother and stepson, bound by titles and expectations. We were two people who had found something rare, something worth fighting for. "I want to keep this," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I want to hold on to this feeling, to you." My heart clenched at the sincerity in her words, at the hope and fear that mirrored my own. "Then let's hold on," I replied, my voice steady, reassuring. "Let's face whatever comes next, together." She smiled, a radiant, unguarded smile that lit up her entire face, and in that moment I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever the world might think, we would face it side by side. The connection between us, fragile yet unbreakable, was ours to protect, to nurture, and I knew I would do everything in my power to keep it. As the night descended, wrapping us in a gentle cocoon, we sat together in the quiet of the garden, hand in hand, hearts intertwined, ready to face the uncertain road ahead, bound by a love that felt as timeless as the stars above us. We lingered there in the dim light, wrapped in a silence that felt sacred, a shared understanding between two people who had crossed an uncharted threshold. The garden around us had fallen into shadows, but in each other's presence the world felt warm, filled with a glow that no fading sunlight could match. Lila leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder, her fingers intertwined with mine, as though she were holding on to this moment with everything she had. Finally she sighed, a deep, quiet sound, and looked up at me, her expression a mixture of peace and apprehension. "I know this won't be easy," she murmured, as if reading my thoughts. "We have a choice now, to step forward into the unknown, or let go." I felt the weight of her words settle over me, a reminder of the reality waiting beyond this garden, of the expectations, the judgments, the complications that would come. But looking into her eyes, I knew that no amount of reason, no argument against us, could change the depth of what I felt for her. I couldn't pretend that this connection, this intimacy, was something I could forget or let slip away. Not now. Lila, I said softly, lifting her hand to my lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers. I don't want to let go. Whatever it takes, I want to face it with you. My words were simple, but I meant every one. She searched my face, her eyes filled with a gratitude so deep it made my heart ache. You have no idea how much that means to me, she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. I didn't think anyone could care this much. Her voice trailed off, and she blinked away tears, a smile breaking through the vulnerability in her gaze. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close, and for a long moment we simply held each other, feeling the warmth of shared promises, silent yet real. The future was a looming unknown, but with her in my arms I felt a courage I hadn't known I possessed, a courage to embrace this love, to protect it no matter the cost. As we rose to leave the garden hand in hand, I felt a sense of quiet certainty settle over me. Our path might not be easy, and there would be moments of doubt, of struggle. But whatever the future held, I knew that we would face it side by side, anchored by a love that had begun in silence and blossomed into something undeniable. And in that moment, as we walked into the night, leaving the sanctuary of the garden behind us, I felt a calmness I hadn't known before, a deep assurance that, come what may, we were in this together.